Matt Ho is a Marine Corps veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq. Matt worked for the State Department, but in 2009 resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan over American escalation of the war. He is currently the Associate Director, Eisenhower Media Network. He's written for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Counterpunch, CNN, Defense News, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Mother Jones, the Raleigh News and Observer, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and more. And he's been invited to and spoken at the UN. So with that, I will turn it over to Matt. Take it away, Matt. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Jim. It's nice to be here. It's great to see a lot of people who I haven't seen in a long time. Hopefully, I'll get to see some of you all in person at some point. I mean, hopefully, maybe next year we'll have an in-person convention, right? Really, if I had to put a title to this, I would say that the title of this would be "Why the War Will Go On." I'm not in the camp that believes this war is going to end anytime soon. And from what I see, I believe there's a real pathway for us to be sitting here talking about this war a year from now, 2 years from now. It'll look different, right? It'll have different levels of activity. But it more or less will be the same war. So let me just go through it in the sense of how I see Ukraine, how I see Russia, how I see the EU separate from NATO and then the United States. And I'll try and do this in about as quickly as I can so we can get into the conversation. But, in terms of where these four players are at and why this war can go on. In Ukraine, of course, the ruling government needs this to go on. If it doesn't, they're either going to be, they're going to have to abscond. They're going to have to act like the Afghan government in 2021. And abscond to their villas and their mansions and their condos, whether they're in Dubai or Miami or whatnot. So they need to go on for their own preservation. In order to do that, they need to keep the United States and NATO and the EU in this war. This is the purpose of Volodymyr Zelensky coming to the United Nations next week. So next Tuesday, I believe, he's going to present his victory plan. It will be nothing of the sort. It'll just essentially be more of the same, I believe. We see this need to try and keep the U.S., to keep the Europeans, keep that particularly economic support. The military support, absolutely essential for the Ukrainians. But more importantly, in my estimation, is the economic support. If the Ukrainian economy collapses, if the Ukrainian government collapses, that's it. It's over. And there are signs that the Ukrainian economy is at risk of collapse. Those signs continue to worsen every month. All three major credit rating agencies, just for example, all three major credit rating agencies in August downgraded Ukraine to pre-default ratings. Okay, I mean, so basically the only thing keeping them from actually getting that default rating is the fact that they've got the backing of the United States and Europe. That to me is Ukraine's greatest danger right now. It's certainly military collapse, military loss, that's all there. But for me, this idea that they could, the surest way for Ukrainian defeat in all this is for the economy to collapse and then as well the government, because the government is nothing more than a Patriots network. So the biggest danger then is what we saw happen in 2021, where the Afghan government collapses, and that collapse begins well before the United States actually leaves Afghanistan, because what happens is just the panic sets in. The panic sets in at the fear of the money's going to stop coming. And so when you have such a corrupt Patriots network, a kleptocracy, as whether it's the Afghan government or the Ukrainian government, just that fear of the money not coming in will cause everything to fall apart. The house of cards will go down, right? Because those who are taking the money at the top, they're afraid that no more money is going to come in. They won't keep passing it along, and then the whole system stops working. If I was advising Volodymyr Zelensky, and if I was to put my hat back on from 15 years or so ago, and I think in Veterans for Peace, particularly those of us who were in the Iraq and Afghan wars, we're experts at false hope. particularly giving false hope to others, with false hope we gave to the Iraqis, false hope we gave to the Afghans. So I think I probably could give a pretty good job, do a pretty good job of advising the Ukrainians and providing that to them, this false hope. But one of the things I would say to Zelensky is, look, when you come to New York, yeah, of course, meet President Biden, Vice President Harris, former President Trump, do your rounds on CNN and wherever. But most importantly, get in with Wall Street, get in with the CEOs of BlackRock, State Street, Goldman Sachs, because they're the ones who were promised the reconstruction of this war. They're the ones who are looking at $1 trillion rebuilding Ukraine. And so similar to World War I, where Wilson, the American bankers went to Wilson and they said, look, if Britain and France lose, we're not getting our money back. You need to send the American army over there. One of several reasons for our entrance into that war, right? But certainly one. Same thing here. Of course, that our bankers haven't put money into the Ukraine war, but they've been promised it. And if they want their tens of billions or hundreds of billions or trillions, they better make sure that that Ukrainian government stays afloat. Same time, too, I tell Zelensky, go to the military industrial complex, go visit with the CEOs of Lockheed and General Dynamics and Raytheon and say, you've been promised tens and tens of billions of dollars. You know, the United States Congress has appropriated about $185 billion to Ukraine. About 45 billion or 50 billion or so has gone for economic assistance. About 50 billion has gone for direct military support, most of which is terms inventory out of the U.S. that is backfilled by these contractors. This is why they're making so much money off of this thing. But then that other roughly $100 billion or so, $80 to $100 billion, is for future contracts. These are all for weapons that we have contracted out to the military industrial complex to produce in future years for Ukraine. So if I was Zelensky, I go to these guys at Raytheon and Lockheed and Boeing and say, if you want that money, you better keep this war going. You better keep us afloat, right? And at the same time, too, you know, one of the things that will come up about Ukraine, of course, is the manpower issues, and those are very true, absolutely a big issue. But remember, Ukraine does not draft below the age of 26. So they've got all their 17 and 18-year-olds up to 25-year-olds who they can draft. That's half a generation that they can throw into this meat grinder, that they can feed to this furnace to keep the war going. So, you know, this aspect of Ukraine losing is certainly there, but there's also a pathway that we can see this war continuing as long as Ukraine's economy and government stays afloat. With Russia, you know, Russia had very limited aims in this war, and they almost achieved them. The idea was invade and force negotiations. And they got those negotiations, and those negotiations almost bore fruit. And then they didn't when the Americans and the British pulled the Ukrainians out of the negotiations in April of 2022. And, you know, so for the Russians now, they're in this war, and their goals are steadily broadening. So initially, their goals were not to annex parts of Ukraine. Their goals were not to be an occupying force in Ukraine, but because they did not achieve that negotiated settlement that they wanted, they are now stuck, right? And the issue for the Russians as well, a couple of issues for why I call this a status quo. It's understandable why the Ukrainians can't throw a knockout punch and take the Russians out. But the same for the Russians. If you look at where the front lines are in the East, you look how much bigger the country is, in the sense that in 2.5 years, the Russians have only occupied roughly 10% of Ukraine. They occupied, when they took Crimea in 2014, that was about 8% of Ukraine. And now there's about 10%, maybe 11 or 12% now over the last several months. But, you know, there's so much more of Ukraine left that the Russians don't have the capacity militarily to occupy the entire nation unless they want to have a redo of the United States and Iraq, which the Russians are too smart for. So the problems for the Russians right now are that the farther east they move, which is an imperative because they have to continue to advance. It's just the military inertia of it all. The farther west they move, the farther they then go into Ukrainian-speaking territory, right? So to oversimplify it, you have Russian speakers and you have Ukrainian speakers. The Russian speakers, again, oversimplifying, but generally more receptive to the Russians. Ukrainian speakers, less incentive. So as you push farther west, you still have this conventional line of almost 600 miles and you're now increasing the odds of an insurgency in those occupied areas. So this is why I say the Russians are stuck. All right. I mean, the other aspect of too is that the Russian economy is doing great. I mean, particularly when you look at the sanctions that were thrown at it, you see that the Russians really prepared well for this, a number of different things. But certainly we can talk about the economics of it if you want later. But the issue is that there's always a cost to a foreign war. There always is. And, as we see today, if you're watching Democracy News this morning or Democracy Now, you heard that Russia's going to increase their army to over 1.5 million men, more than the increase of 180,000. I mean, the cost will come. Foreign wars always bear a cost. I mean, as Veterans for Peace, I think we all know that. And whether or not the Russians are able to continue to keep the war as a necessary thing for their public. Certainly right now they are. The last 2.5 years, they've done well in terms of public opinion. But I'll also remind you, it wasn't until late 2006, maybe midway through 2006, 3.5 years into the Iraq War, a war that clearly was built upon lies, right? That the American media at least somewhat talked about. And then, of course, the opposition to the war, which in the United States was great in '03. Certainly public opinion wise, almost 80% of Americans supported it. But it takes 3.5 years for American public opinion to really turn around on the Iraq war. Right. So, I mean, in the sense that while the Russians are doing well, when you look at the various metrics of this, is time really on your side? If you start talking about not next year, not the year after that, but 3 or 4 years from now, are they still going to be able to have the support for this war that they need? And that's something that the Russians, I don't believe, want to roll the dice on. And so I think you'll see an increased. Well, let's put it this way: the Russians have always been offering to negotiate. They've always been. I mean, before the February 2022 invasion, immediately after we discussed, all through 2023, and even in all through this year, they have said they're open to talks. Even after the Kursk invasion by Ukraine into Russia, the Russians at first said, no, no more talking. And then a couple of weeks later, they said, of course, we're willing to talk. But what happens is that what they want, what they need, continue to expand. And that's based upon the aspect of being stuck in this and what this war has certainly become. And what the danger of it is that if you get this war becomes even more stabilized than it is, with a front that barely moves, which is very possible. You end up running the risk of having something similar to what they had in Iraq and Iran in the 1980s, where you have the War of the Cities, where you just have each side trying to pulverize the other side's cities, not for any purposes of thinking you're going to demoralize the enemy and get them to quit the war, but to show your people what you're doing to the other side. Right. And we all understand how that dynamic works and how that escalation builds upon itself. So, the other thing the Russians don't want either is the Russians don't want a failed state in Ukraine. Right. The Russians don't want to see the Ukrainian government completely collapse because they don't want an Afghanistan. They don't want a Syria on their front doorstep or side doorstep or back doorstep, whichever way you want to look at it, right? I mean, this is a very real concern for the Russians, the idea that Ukraine collapses and you have a humanitarian crisis there that then becomes a story about all these warlords with all these weapons. Okay, that's not what the Russians want. And so I really do believe the Russians want to find a negotiated end to this. And that's why we're so foolish in not taking them up on that. I want to move on to, we can get into more of this later. One more thing about it is also do believe that the Russians are receiving pressure from the Chinese, from the Indians, to others, the Turks, to end this war. So I think, because I think their allies view the largest conventional war in Europe as not anything that should be continued. Right, the largest conventional war since World War II, as anything that this world needs to see. Right, so I think they're getting pressure from their allies to a degree to negotiate. Their allies are not going to tell them to stop. Certainly, the North Koreans or the Iranians are not going to stop selling them things. But at the same time, too, I think when you talk about the Chinese, the Indians, their major trading partners, they would prefer to see stability versus war. The EU, which is separate from NATO, Um, well, the EU doesn't want to see a failed state in Ukraine either, right? They don't. The political cost of this war for and the economic cost of this war for the Europeans have been great. You know, a couple of years ago, the saying in Britain was they had a choice of heating or eating, right? Because of the inflation caused by this war. And so we have seen the political costs of this war in Britain, right? Even though Labor took power, that's only because they've got as crazy of an electoral system as we do. You know, the Labor Party won 33% of the vote and they got like 64% of the seats. Right. I mean, so if they had more of an equitable distribution, you would have seen the particularly say the Reform Party, which is very anti-Ukraine war, doing much better in Britain. Just as we saw parties in France and in Germany have done very well that have ending this war in Ukraine as one of their planks. If anyone thinks that Olaf Scholz a week or two ago, when he said we need, the war in Ukraine needs to end soon, it needs to end faster than people have been talking about. We need a negotiated settlement. If anyone thinks Scholz wasn't going to make that comment, if the Alternative for Deutschland party and the Alliance of Sarah Wagenknecht party hadn't done so well in their state elections, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, this showed this a good example of political pressure, how that works. So the Europeans are feeling that, but they're also stuck too, because they can't simply walk away from it because they're part of this trust. They're part of this positive air pressure that's keeping the Ukrainian bubble from bursting, right? Or the balloon, I guess, from bursting, or balloon from deflating, I guess maybe is a better way to put it. And so what you saw today or yesterday or whatever it was, the EU providing $40 billion in loans to the Ukrainians meant for economic and government purposes, keeping that collapse from happening. Because if Ukraine collapses, they have the same fears as the Russians do, okay, in terms of a failed state with warlords all throughout it, okay? But they also realize that where are most of those refugees going to come? They're going to come. They're going to go west. So the political costs, the economic costs of the refugees, of the cuts to government spending, while they're increasing spending for their own military budgets in Europe, while the inflationary costs of this war, the EU is really feeling that. But they're stuck again. So how can they get out? How can they get out without a negotiated settlement? And here's where the problem is. The EU is not driving this. They're the ones paying the costs, but they're not driving it. And it comes back to NATO and the United States. NATO, of course, this is their whole purpose in life. If everyone remembers just a few years ago, we could have had a very serious discussion about and we can still have a serious discussion about, don't get me wrong, but this idea of what's the purpose of NATO. In the Ukraine war, the Russian villain, right? That gives NATO its purpose. And if they lose the Donbass, well, hey, you know what? That's our Jerusalem. We have to take it back, right? So it gives NATO purpose. So if you're NATO, right, and you're really all these military chiefs, why would you argue for anything other than the narrative, the victory narrative that has been espousing all along? And you see this in Jens Stoltenberg, who's leaving as the NATO head. The guy who's coming in to replace him, Mark Rutte, who's, I think, 14 years as the Dutch prime minister. He is as aggressive on this, maybe more so, than Stoltenberg is, which is, as you all know, saying quite a lot. So, you have this tension between the EU and NATO, where, of course, NATO sees Ukraine as their reason for being. It gives them purpose, and it justifies the tens and tens of billions of dollars in spending that they're now able to say is necessary to defend their people from this great Russian menace, right? From this modern day Hitler, so on and so forth. And who's paying those costs? It's the EU. So there's this tension in Europe over it that is really, really causing a lot of pain for the European people, as well as prolonging the suffering of Ukraine, right? I mean, because the Ukrainians essentially being used as pawns in this proxy war by NATO and the US against Russia. And so you see this really terrible, terrible dynamic occurring here in Europe that you just don't, how are they going to get out of this? Because when you get to the Americans, this is about profit and identity for the United States. I'm trying to come up with any other explanation for it other than megalomania and greed. This is about the wants, the needs, the ambition of the empire. Certainly, there is some tension within the Republican Party with regards to Russia. But if you look at how the votes went back in the spring, back in April, on the $61 billion that Congress appropriated for Ukraine, a lot more Republicans voted for it than against it. And if Trump can be persuaded that that's what needs to be, then those other folks will get in line too, right? So certainly the Democrats. I don't know if any Democrats in the House voted against the Ukraine spending, and I'm not so certain about the Senate either. I don't know if Welch did or not. I can't remember. Or Sanders. I don't think Sanders. I don't think Sanders. I can't remember Sanders did or not. If someone can remember, please remind me. But certainly, if you look at the polling on this, Cato Institute did a poll last week of voters in the three key swing states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And what it found was that there's still substantial support among the American people for the war in Ukraine. While it certainly has changed, the number of folks supporting this war has gone down. And we all know, walking around their neighborhoods, driving around, we don't see as many blue and yellow flags as we did 2 years ago, right? But there still is support for it. And when you look at the Democratic Party, there's a high degree of support for it. When asked in that Cato poll of Democratic voters, of Democratic registered voters, or likely Harris voters, over a majority of those voters say that they still support the Ukraine war if it means the U.S. and Russia going to war, right? So you have a majority of Democratic Party voters who are willing to go to war with Russia because they feel it's necessary. And the Biden-Harris administration understand this. They understand that for their people, the bluest, the most loyal people they have, that the identification with the Ukraine war is something that the Democrats have worked very hard on in the last 10 years to put together, right? Because this is a nearly decade-long decade-long campaign of Russiagate. And so how can you abandon that now? How, 2 months before the election, can you say we're going to negotiate with the Russians, where for the last 10 years, you have been telling your people, the American public, but especially your people, that this is what your identity is all about. This is about standing up to dictators. This is about standing up for democracy and against authoritarianism, right? So this is a problem that how does the Democratic Party get itself out of? The Republican Party, of course, at least among its elites, primarily in favor of this. I don't believe anything Trump says. But certainly if you look at what he said, say, before the election in 2016 and then how he acted in the White House, I don't think any of us should have hope that he's actually going to want to end this war, other than if he thinks he can get some type of credit for it, right? If somehow it's going to improve his brand. And it's all going to depend for Trump, I believe, who he puts into that office. If it's Nikki Haley, if it's Tom Cotton, if it's those types in his cabinet, we'll understand where it's going. Just as we should have understood it back in January of 2016 when he puts Jim Mattis, John Kelly, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, etc., into his government. So I mean that's the issue. And then of course the profits, the money being made off of this is so good, right? And as we discussed before, so where's the pressure going to come from that on? And then, of course, you have the officers of the empire, those who believe that this is their life's purpose, their life's work. So I'm talking about the retired generals and the admirals. I'm talking about the pundits who go on television, the people at the think tank, members of Congress who are true believers in all this, who will advocate for this until we are all incinerated by H-bombs. If people did not see last week, and they were quoted in the New York Times and across the board in mainstream media, a collection of about 24 or so retired admirals and generals. Names are all familiar, along with diplomats. So names like Hodges and Breedlove and Brzezinski and McFaul and others, put forward this letter urging Joe Biden to allow these longer range U.S. missiles to be used by Ukraine against Russia. And they basically, the argument came down to one, it was just the same nonsense about how a wonder weapon is going to win a war, which shows just actually how much they're politicians as opposed to how much they're actually military professionals. But that's what you should expect. There's no way you're getting to be a 3 or 4 star general admiral in the United States military unless you believe and you want what the empire wants you to believe and needs you to believe. And I'm talking to you all, so you all understand that, right? But so you have those true believers there. You have the political necessity of it, and then you have all the money being made in it. And so it's hard to see in the next few months how anything changes from the American side. And I am scared that they will authorize those longer range missiles next week, that Biden's saying that we're not going to authorize them now was just to synchronize the messaging so that it's lined up that when Volodymyr Zelensky comes to New York next week and presents his victory plan, that then, that plan will include these longer range missiles, and Joe Biden will say, hey, I'm on board, Volodymyr. I'm with you for the big win. Let's go, team. Because the pressure under Biden, and I'll end with this, the pressure under Biden in D.C. is immense right now. If you look throughout, the Politico and Defense News and other places, and the commentary, that the political commentary associated with Capitol Hill and what they're saying to the White House and everything, it's all about Biden's legacy. Is Joe Biden going to end his time as a public servant, as the man who stirred up to a dictator, or is he going to tie the Ukrainians' hands behind their backs and betray them? And we all know that storyline, right? We've all heard that storyline before, but it's an effective one, at least in D.C. And so that's, I think, the pressure being put on Joe Biden. My understanding, and from others I know as well too, is that the Pentagon, God help us, because the Pentagon seems to be the same ones in this possibly. The Pentagon are the ones who are saying, do not put forward these missiles. Do not let them use these missiles. One, it's irrelevant. It's going to make no difference to the war. But two, you're playing chicken with guys who have always lived up to what they've said. And, I'll end it there with that. And happy to talk about, yeah, really anything. But thank you all for having me here with you.